The forgotten battle of Kapelsche Veer, Operation Elephant. It was one of the smallest islands in Europe, barely 5 miles long and a mile wide. Yet for weeks, soldiers fought, bled, and died over this frozen patch of Dutch farmland. Hundreds of men would fall, and the fighting was so bitter that even seasoned veterans compared it to Monte Cassino in Italy. But why? Why did the Allies pour so much blood into this place? And why were the Germans so determined to hold it at all costs? To answer that, we need to rewind a few months, back to the failure of Operation Market Garden in September 1944. After Market Garden, the Stalemate. Operation Market Garden had been billed as the bold stroke that would end the war in Europe. If it worked, the Allies would bypass the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine, and plunge into the industrial heart of Germany. British Field Marshal Montgomery had promised a knockout blow that would bring Hitler's empire to its knees. But instead of triumph, the operation ended in disaster. At Arnhem, the paratroopers of the British 1st Airborne Division were cut off and destroyed. The bridge too far became a haunting phrase, a symbol of dashed hopes. In the aftermath, the Allies didn't gain victory. They gained a problem. What they held was a long, thin salient, a corridor of land stretching north from Belgium into the Netherlands. This bulge gave them some advantages. Most importantly, the huge road bridge at Nijmegen, captured intact by American paratroopers. That bridge was gold. It gave the Allies a way across the Waal River, a vital step toward Germany. But every advantage came with a danger. The salient was exposed on both flanks. German troops, still determined and organized, lurked on either side, ready to cut into the narrow supply line. The failure at Arnhem meant the Allies were stuck. Instead of rushing forward into Germany, they were now tied down defending a precarious stretch of land. And in this frozen winter landscape, the enemy still held pieces of ground that simply refused to fall. One of those pieces was Kapelsche Veer. At first glance, it looked meaningless. A tiny island, no cities, no factories, no obvious prize. Just farmland and dikes, battered by winter storms. Yet the Germans turned it into a fortress. From here, they could observe Allied movements, direct artillery fire, and launch raids across the frozen rivers. They could harass supply convoys rolling up the Nijmegen corridor. The Allies knew what it meant. As long as Kapelsche Veer remained in German hands, their flank was never safe. But getting rid of that thorn would prove far harder than anyone could imagine. Because the Germans weren't just holding an island. They were making a statement that even after Arnhem, even after losing ground across France and Belgium, they could still stand firm, still bleed the Allies, still show the world that the Reich wasn't finished. And so, this tiny speck of land became the stage for one of the fiercest small battles of the entire campaign. The island of Kapelsche Veer, Kapelsche Veer. On a map, it was nothing more than a sliver of land, a low island pressed between the freezing waters of the Maas River, northeast of Breda in the Netherlands. Barely 5 miles long, scarcely a mile wide, it was farmland and dikes, churned into a cold swamp by winter rains and snow. Yet in war, even the smallest pieces of land can become priceless. The island sat in a bend of the Maas where the river split into subsidiary channels. Whoever held it could see deep into enemy territory. From its raised dikes, German observers tracked every Allied vehicle, every artillery movement, every patrol daring to cross the open snow. With field radios linking them to mortar batteries and heavy guns on the far bank, the island became a perfect forward fortress, a German eye and dagger thrust into the Allied front. The defenders were not ordinary soldiers. They were Fallschirmjäger German paratroopers, with a reputation carved from Crete, Monte Cassino, and Normandy. Even in 1945, as the Reich staggered on its last legs, the Fallschirmjäger remained some of Germany's most disciplined and ruthless troops. Rotated every few days to stay sharp, they dug themselves deep into the dikes and farmhouses of Kapelsche Veer, creating bunkers, tunnels, and firing points invisible under the snow. For General Kurt Student, commander of Army Group H and the architect of Germany's airborne forces, Kapelsche Veer was a thorn to be planted firmly in the Allies' side. His orders were explicit. The island must be held at all costs. For the Allies, it became an infuriating anomaly. On every other front, the Germans were falling back. Towns were being liberated, rivers crossed, villages abandoned. But here, on this miserable patch of mud and frozen farmland, the enemy stood and refused to move. Every attempt to dislodge them was punished. The open approaches to the island were killing fields, snow-covered plains with no cover, swept by machine guns and mortars zeroed in with mathematical precision. Polish armored units tried and failed. Royal Marine Commandos advanced with courage, only to be cut down. The Canadians, too, would soon learn the same bitter lesson. Kapelsche Veer was small, but it was stubborn, and for weeks it became the focus of a forgotten battle, a frozen island fortress that simply would not fall. First attempts. Poles and Commandos. The Allies could not ignore Kapelsche Veer. Every day that the Germans clung to the island, Allied supply lines were threatened, troop movements observed, and morale gnawed at by the knowledge that enemy paratroopers sat defiantly on their side of the river. Something had to be done. The first serious attempt came in the closing days of December 1944. The Polish 1st Armored Division, fighting under Canadian command, was ordered to sweep the island clean. These were men hardened by years of exile and battles across Europe. Poles who had fought their way from Normandy through Belgium and into the Netherlands, determined to strike at the Reich that had destroyed their homeland. But when they crossed into the killing ground before Kapelsche Veer, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare. German mortars rained shells with chilling accuracy. Machine gun fire slashed across the snowfields. Every advance stalled in open ground where there was no cover, no place to dig in. By the time the Poles pulled back, 120 of their comrades were casualties, dead, wounded, or missing, and the island remained untouched. Undeterred, the Allies tried again. This time it was the turn of Britain's elite. On the 13th of January 1945, Number 47, Royal Marine Commando, was ordered forward in Operation Horse. Specialists in raids and close-quarter fighting, the commandos advanced across the white expanse with grim determination. But the Germans were waiting. Mortars howled down, cutting gaps through the ranks. The Marines pressed on, only to be met by a storm of small arms fire from hidden bunkers. Within hours, their advance was shredded. 49 men lay dead or wounded in the snow. The survivors were forced to withdraw, leaving behind the bodies of their brothers. The lesson was becoming brutally clear. This would not be another quick push. Kapelsche Veer was no mere riverbank outpost, it was a fortress, manned by soldiers who refused to bend, no matter the odds. For the Allies, every failed attempt deepened the sense of urgency. The island was not just a tactical nuisance. It was fast becoming a test of pride, morale, and determination. If the Germans could hold this tiny strip of land indefinitely, what would that say about Allied strength in the Netherlands? The decision was made. The job would now pass to the Canadians, and unlike the smaller raids before, this next attempt would not be a probing strike. It would be a full-scale assault. An operation with a name as heavy as its intent. Operation Elephant. Operation Elephant, the Canadian gamble. By mid-January 1945, it was clear to Allied commanders that small raids and probing attacks had failed. Kapelsche Veer was no ordinary island. It was a fortress, defended by determined German paratroopers, who seemed almost immovable. To dislodge them would take overwhelming force, careful planning, and nerves of steel. The task fell to the Canadian 4th Armored Division, one of the most disciplined and battle-hardened formations in the Allied Army. They dubbed the mission Operation Elephant, a name that spoke not of subtlety, but of weight, power, and inevitability. This was no mere raid, it was a gamble, a calculated push to break the stalemate once and for all. Brigadier J.C. Jefferson and his 10th Armored Brigade were assigned the assault. The plan was ambitious. 2 infantry battalions would attack from the east, 1 from the west, supported by tanks and massive artillery. Every movement would be coordinated, every step protected by smoke screens to obscure the defenders' line of sight. Flamethrower carriers, nicknamed Wasps, would spearhead the advance, sending streams of fire into enemy bunkers. The Germans, however, were not unprepared. General Student had reinforced the garrison to 150 men from the 13th Parachute Regiment. Every house, every farm, every dike was turned into a fortress. Observation posts were linked directly to artillery on the far bank, and every path across the snow and frozen mud was a trap. The students' orders were clear: hold the island at all costs. At dawn on the 26th of January, the Canadians began to move. Smoke curled across the icy landscape, masking the advance. Tanks rumbled forward across the makeshift bridge. Infantry followed in buffalo armored carriers, and engineers prepared a second bridge to allow more tanks to join the fight. But the Germans were relentless. Mortars pounded the advancing troops. Machine guns shredded ranks, and the frozen ground offered no cover. Even as the Canadians clawed forward, the defenders struck back with terrifying precision, repulsing attacks and forcing units to dig in under a hail of fire. The Canadians were learning what the Poles and Commandos had already discovered. Kapelsche Veer was not just defended, it was a trap, a proving ground, a crucible designed to test every ounce of Allied courage and skill. Yet, despite the chaos and carnage, the Canadians pressed on. Artillery barrages softened some positions. Flamethrowers roared. Tanks smashed through dikes. By the end of the first day, small footholds had been gained, but the island was far from captured. The gamble had begun, and the cost was already high. For the men of the 4th Armored Division, Operation Elephant would become a battle of attrition, courage, and sheer determination. A struggle where every step forward demanded sacrifice, and where victory was measured not in miles of ground, but in inches of frozen, blood-soaked soil. First day, fire and chaos. The morning of January 26, 1945, dawned bitterly cold over Kapelsche Veer. The air was sharp, the snow a blinding white, and the river's icy waters lapped hungrily at the island's dikes. For the men of the Canadian 4th Armored Division, it would be a day unlike any other a day where planning collided with the brutal reality of combat. As the smoke screen began to roll across the island at 7:15, the first waves of infantry advanced. C Company of the Lincoln and Welland Regiment crossed the Mad Hoare Dream Bridge, accompanied by 4 Wasp flamethrower carriers. The tanks rumbled behind them, steel beasts in the frozen landscape. Engineers and canoe parties followed, attempting to ferry men across icy channels under relentless fire. But chaos struck almost immediately. Canoes were riddled by machine gun fire, and of 60 men on one mission, only 15 made it halfway to their objective. Mortars screamed overhead, explosions throwing snow and ice into the air like deadly hail. Every step forward was contested, every advance measured in inches of frozen, blood-soaked earth. The Canadians reached fortified positions, houses codenamed Grapes and Raspberry, only to be driven back by fierce German resistance. Counterattacks surged from dug-in paratroopers, and the infantry was forced to halt under a storm of fire. Commanders were killed, squads scattered, and confusion swept across the island like wildfire. Even with tanks and flamethrowers, progress was agonizingly slow. The Germans used every advantage of the terrain. Dikes that were 20 feet high, snow-laden fields of fire, and underground bunkers that provided both protection and lethal ambush points. The first day became a harrowing ordeal of survival and tenacity. By midday, the assault was halted. Every attempt to push forward ended in slaughter, and the Canadians were forced to dig in under constant bombardment. On the western side, B Company faced similar horror, pinned down by machine gun nests and mortar fire. The snow, once a symbol of winter's purity, was now streaked with the blood of men on both sides. It was clear that Kapelsche Veer was no ordinary objective. The tiny island had turned into a storm of fire, chaos, and calculated death. The Canadians had gambled, and the cost was staggering, but retreat was not an option. They had to learn, adapt, and strike again. The first day had ended in fire and chaos, but it had also revealed a grim truth. The island would not fall without courage, cunning, and an unwavering determination to fight inch by inch against one of the fiercest and most disciplined enemy forces of the war. Stalemate in the mud. By January 27, 1945, the initial fury of Operation Elephant had given way to something far more grueling, a deadly stalemate. Kapelsche Veer had revealed its true nature, a frozen, mud-choked trap where every advance came at a punishing cost. The Canadians were now locked in a battle not just with German paratroopers, but with the terrain itself. Temperatures began to rise, melting the snow and turning the island's surface into a morass of mud and ice. Every step became an ordeal. Every tank, infantry carrier, and soldier struggled through the treacherous ground. Vehicles bogged down, bridges creaked under the weight of armored columns, and the mud swallowed men and machines alike. German defenders, entrenched in their bunkers and tunnels, seemed impervious to the freezing misery. Mortars and machine guns cut down any who dared to advance. Observation posts, linked to artillery across the river, meant every movement was spotted and punished. Even Canadian artillery, powerful as it was, could only suppress, not destroy, the fortified positions. The struggle was slow, brutal, and unrelenting. In the east, Sherman struggled to climb the dikes, their treads spinning helplessly in the mud. Infantry slogged through the muck, weighed down by packs and weapons, all while under constant fire. In the west, the engineering units labored desperately to assemble makeshift rafts to bring tanks across the channels, racing against both the clock and enemy fire. Every day, the toll mounted. Officers and soldiers alike learned the harsh lesson that in Kapelsche Veer, even the smallest gains were bought with blood. The Germans exploited every advantage: tunnels, fortified farmhouses, and the natural defenses of the flooded, mud-choked terrain to hold their island fortress. Yet, despite the frustration, the Canadians did not relent. Artillery barrages softened some positions, flamethrowers roared, and tanks pushed forward wherever the mud allowed. The fighting became a test of endurance, courage, and ingenuity. Every foot gained was a victory, every retreat a bitter reminder of the island's tenacity. By the end of the day, the Canadians had made limited progress. Grapes and Raspberry, the fortified houses at the heart of the island, remained contested. The stalemate in the mud was total, a grinding, bitter struggle where neither side could claim decisive control, and the price in men and material continued to climb. Kapelsche Veer had proven that in war, geography can be as deadly as any soldier, and that determination alone could turn a tiny island into one of the most formidable battlefields of the Netherlands in 1945. The final push. By January 28, 1945, it was clear to the Canadian commanders the only way to break the stalemate at Kapelsche Veer was with overwhelming force. The mud, the snow, and the frozen dikes had slowed progress to a crawl, but retreat was not an option. Every attempt so far had failed, and the tiny island fortress still bristled with German paratroopers ready to strike. The plan for the final push was bold. Tanks would lead the assault, supported by infantry and flamethrowers. Artillery fire would pound the German positions relentlessly, softening defenses and keeping the enemy under pressure. Every unit knew the stakes the island had to fall, both to secure the front and to restore morale after weeks of frustrating stalemate. The Canadians moved at first light. Shermans rolled across the Mad Hor Dream Bridge in the east, while engineers in the west completed a raft system to bring armor to the far side of the island. Infantry waded through mud and ice, every step risking machine gun fire and sudden mortar bursts. Smoke screens obscured movement, but they could not hide the terrifying accuracy of the German defenders. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Tanks struggled against dikes and frozen ground, while infantry advanced through snow and slush. At the eastern end, the Argylls pushed toward Grapes, while Lincoln and Welland Regiment clawed toward Raspberry in the west. Flamethrowers roared, spewing fire into bunkers, while artillery pounded the German positions from the mainland. Small victories came at a terrible cost. Grapes fell to the Argylls after fierce resistance, followed by Raspberry taken by Lincoln and Welland. But the Germans were not finished. Counterattacks from tunnels and bunkers forced the Canadians to fight house by house, inch by inch. Each advance was met with ferocious resistance, reminding the troops that the island's defenders were some of the most determined paratroopers in the war. By the end of the day, the Canadians had secured key objectives, but the battle was far from over. Tanks had bogged down in mud, infantry was exhausted, and German mortar and machine gun fire continued to make every step deadly. Yet, the final push had shifted the momentum. The island's defenses were crumbling, and the Canadians had proven that persistence, combined with coordinated armor and artillery, could break even the most stubborn resistance. Kapelsche Veer, once a symbol of German stubbornness, was finally on the brink of falling. The final push had begun to pay off, and the stage was set for the concluding battle, a struggle that would test courage, strategy, and the will of men fighting in one of the harshest winters of the war. The cost of victory. By the morning of January 31st, 1945, Kapelsche Veer had finally been wrested from German hands, but victory had come at a staggering cost. The tiny island, no more than 5 miles long and a mile wide at its widest point, had been transformed into a battlefield of mud, blood, and shattered courage. The Germans had evacuated quietly under cover of darkness, leaving behind the ruins of their bunkers, demolished observation posts, and the echoes of fierce resistance. But for the Canadians, the toll was undeniable. Operation Elephant had claimed 133 killed and wounded in the 4th Armored Division alone. The earlier assaults by Polish troops and Royal Marines had cost another 231 men. In total, the Allies had lost 364 brave soldiers in the attempt to capture a tiny, snow-covered island, a stark reminder of how deadly determined defenders could be, even in the war's final months. German casualties, though lower in number, reflected the intensity of the fighting. 64 killed or wounded, and 34 taken prisoner. Every man had fought with the resolve of a cornered animal, holding the island against overwhelming odds. The paratroopers' discipline and tenacity had turned a small piece of territory into a symbol of stubborn resistance, and even in defeat, they had earned a grim respect from the Canadians. The Battle of Kapelsche Veer showcased not just courage, but strategy, perseverance, and the brutal realities of war. The Canadians had learned that even seemingly small objectives could demand extraordinary effort, that terrain could be as deadly as any enemy, and that victory was measured not only in territory gained, but in the cost paid in human lives. For the Allies, the fall of the island restored morale, secured observation points along the Mars River, and denied the Germans a critical foothold in Allied territory. But the memory of the struggle, the mud, the snow, the relentless German fire, and the courage of soldiers on both sides would linger long after the guns fell silent. Kapelsche Veer, once a stubborn thorn in the Allied line, had finally been cleared. The operation proved beyond doubt that determination, coordination, and the willingness to endure immense hardship could overcome even the most resolute defenses. Yet the human cost remained a sobering reminder that in war, even victory can leave scars that run deep. Conclusion. Lessons from Kapelsche Veer. Kapelsche Veer may have been small in size, but its story looms large in the history of the Second World War. The island became a testing ground for courage, strategy, and endurance, a place where every decision, every movement, and every act of bravery mattered. The battle showed that even in the war's final months, German soldiers could fight with remarkable skill and determination, and that the Allies would need every ounce of ingenuity and resolve to overcome them. Operation Elephant demonstrated the harsh realities of combat. Victories are rarely easy, and every gain comes with a price. The Canadians, Poles, and Royal Marines had all paid dearly, inching forward through mud, snow, and relentless fire, learning that persistence, coordination, and courage were the only keys to success. The stubborn paratroopers of the 13th Regiment may have eventually yielded, but their legacy of discipline and tenacity left a lasting mark on the Allies who faced them. More than a story of tactics and strategy, the Battle of Kapelsche Veer is a tale of human endurance. It reminds us that even a tiny island can demand extraordinary effort, and that the courage of ordinary soldiers can turn the tide of a fight. Every bridge crossed, every trench taken, and every bunker stormed was a testament to the bravery of those who fought in frozen fields under the most grueling conditions. In the end, the capture of Kapelsche Veer secured the Allied front, denied the Germans a vital foothold, and restored morale at a critical moment. But beyond the maps and military reports, it stands as a vivid reminder of the costs of war, the resilience of soldiers, and the relentless determination that shaped the outcome of the Second World War in the Netherlands. Kapelsche Veer may be forgotten by many today, but its story endures a testament to the courage, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve of those who faced one of the war's most stubborn defenses and emerged victorious, inch by painstaking inch.